During the final approach to Mueang International Airport in Thailand, a Qantas 747 encounters a powerful storm. Despite the severe weather, the pilots choose to proceed with the landing. Another Qantas 747 in line to land on runway 21 left decides to abort and circle back. But Flight 001 pushes forward, aiming to land despite the rough conditions. In aviation, small mistakes can lead to major consequences, and what started as a routine flight quickly becomes an unforgettable experience for everyone on board. Each choice made in the cockpit can set the course towards safety or disaster. What exactly happened on Qantas Flight 001? Here's what we know. On the afternoon of September 23, 1999, a Qantas Boeing 747 was at the gate, preparing for Flight 001 bound for London Heathrow, with a scheduled stop in Bangkok for refueling on this long journey of roughly 8 hours. A total of 391 passengers were set to board, along with 19 crew members. In the cockpit, 3 pilots were assigned for this long flight: the captain, the first officer, and a second officer for additional support. The captain, an experienced pilot, had logged 15,881 flight hours, with 724 hours on the 747-400. Despite holding a lower rank, the first officer had more hours on this specific aircraft model, 5,187 of his total 8,973 flight hours, and would be responsible for the flight segment to Bangkok that afternoon. The second officer, the least experienced, had 6,685 flight hours, 2,961 of which were on the 747-400. All 3 pilots had strong records and impressive backgrounds, setting a solid foundation of experience that seemed to defy the tragic outcome that would later unfold on Flight 001. After the passenger boarding process was completed and the final preparations for the flight were made, the pushback began. During this process, the crew gave the necessary emergency instructions, and in the cockpit, the pilots performed their pre-takeoff checks. It seemed like it would be a calm and clear afternoon for the first part of the flight. However, the weather forecast for Bangkok showed thunderstorms and bad weather, so the captain made last-minute adjustments. He decided to add extra fuel in case they needed to abort the landing and enter a holding pattern over Bangkok. At the time of the accident, this Boeing 747-400 had been in service for 9 years. Qantas had just over 22 of these aircraft, which they used for long-haul flights thanks to their fuel-efficient design and advanced technology. It's also important to mention that the flight engineer's position was replaced with more automated systems, which changed the 747's cockpit from a 3-person crew to just 2, similar to most wide-body aircraft used today. During the taxi to the runway, everything was going smoothly. The pilots made their final checks before takeoff, and the passengers were getting ready for a long and uneventful journey. After being cleared for takeoff, the first officer pushed the engines to full power. The heavy plane started rolling quickly down the runway and smoothly lifted off the ground and began climbing into the sky as the passengers settled in for the long flight ahead. After reaching an altitude of about 35,000 feet, the heavy aircraft leveled off to continue at cruising altitude toward the destination airport. The crew began serving the meals, while the pilots carried out their checks and reviewed the weather information in Bangkok to make any necessary changes before the descent. Apart from that, the flight was going smoothly. After about 7.5 hours of flying, the descent began. Both the captain and first officer reviewed the final report for the approach to Mueang Airport in Bangkok. They already knew that there would be a storm and heavy rain, so they were aware that the landing would be rough and tricky. The control tower directed them to land on runway 21 left. The first officer checked the approach information provided by air traffic control and noticed that the glide slope, or vertical path to runway 21 left, was very steep, and the runway length was shorter than usual. This steep angle made it harder for the pilots to control the speed during the approach, but both pilots were well trained for such challenges. The chart for runway 21 left also indicated that after landing, they would need to taxi all the way to the end of the runway to reach the nearest taxiway. Because of this, the captain decided to set the auto brake to level 2, thinking it would be a routine landing given the weather. However, a moment later, air traffic control notified the first officer about heavy rain, which meant the runway would be wet and braking might be more difficult. The captain then decided to change the auto brake setting to level 3. On wet runways, the most important elements for stopping the plane safely are the reverse thrust from the engines and the drag caused by the spoilers. The wheel brakes are less effective due to hydroplaning caused by the water, something the pilots were well aware of when reviewing the approach. Visibility had also greatly decreased, and the captain could see on the radar that storms were forming, which could further reduce visibility during the approach. As they got closer to the runway, and with all of this in mind, the pilots completed the approach checklist. They would land with a final approach speed of 154 knots, with the flaps extended to 25 degrees. A couple of years before this accident, Qantas had modified certain landing procedures for wet and rainy conditions on this type of aircraft. For example, full reverse thrust used to be required for landing, but now only idle reverse thrust was needed. The flap setting also changed from 30 degrees to 25 degrees, with a slightly higher approach speed, all in an effort to reduce fuel consumption and noise. Unfortunately, these changes would prove to be counterproductive during this landing. They continued their descent, and as this was happening, the first officer was listening to air traffic control's radio updates. The ATC was advising other planes ahead of them, already close to landing, that there was heavy rain at the airport and visibility was about 5 kilometers. The bad weather could already be seen from the cockpit, and the pilots were concerned that conditions like this could lead to strong turbulence or wind shear, situations they were trained to handle. However, a moments later a series of mistakes would lead to dangerous and threatening moments during the final stages of the landing, putting the lives of the passengers at risk. As they got very close to the runway during the approach, the first officer struggled to slow the plane down to the required speed. They tried to activate the air speed brakes, but it didn't work. Meanwhile, the second officer was listening to a radio conversation between a Qantas ground engineer and an airline agent, where they mentioned that the rain on the ground was getting heavier. However, the second officer didn't pass this information to the pilots, not wanting to distract them from their task of flying the aircraft. Once the plane intercepted the glide slope for runway 21 left, it lined up perfectly for the approach, despite the rough weather. Just ahead of them, another plane that was about to land chose to go around instead due to poor conditions at the runway's end. Unfortunately, the pilots of Qantas 01 didn't hear this exchange between the tower and the other aircraft because they were still on the approach frequency, not yet tuned into the tower frequency. As a result, they continued their approach to runway 21 left, unaware of the latest weather update. In the final stage of the approach, the first officer switched off the autopilot, choosing to land the plane manually. They went through the landing checklist, confirming that everything was ready and set for landing in the challenging weather conditions they were facing. It's important to note that the landing setup followed Qantas's established procedures, as mentioned earlier, which would play a critical role in the outcome of this landing. As they neared the runway, Heavy rain caused the first officer to overshoot the safe landing point, staying just above the glide slope and slightly faster than the required landing speed. Despite this, he decided to proceed, essentially bringing the plane down forcefully. Strong winds then complicated the landing. When the first officer began the flare for a smooth touchdown, the plane started to float, making it hard for him to bring it down. Meanwhile, the aircraft kept eating up runway space needed for a safe stop. The captain quickly took over and moved the throttles to full power to initiate a go-around. But by then, the plane had already touched down, so he canceled the go-around and attempted to stop the plane instead by pulling back the throttles. However, in the high-stress moment, he left the throttle for engine N1 in takeoff position, which prevented the spoilers from deploying. As a result, the plane reacted unpredictably, bouncing along the runway as they tried to bring it to a halt. At that critical moment, the first officer wasn't sure who had full control of the plane, so he proceeded with actions to bring it to a stop. He quickly noticed that the throttle for engine N1 was still in takeoff position and immediately pulled it back to landing position. This allowed the spoilers to deploy automatically, but it wasn't enough to significantly slow the plane, which was still barreling down the remaining stretch of runway at high speed. Apart from all this, the auto brake switch had been deactivated because, like the spoilers, all engines needed to be at idle for it to engage, leaving only the spoilers to slow them down. Realizing the plane wasn't stopping, the first officer pressed hard on the brakes, but the massive plane continued down the slick runway at an alarming speed. Neither the captain nor the first officer realized they hadn't activated idle reverse thrust. With water covering the runway, the brakes were nearly useless, and both pilots could see the end of the runway rushing toward them. The plane collided with the runway's ILS antennas and veered off, causing the landing gear to collapse in the soft ground. They skidded for another 100 meters until the plane finally came to a halt, close to a local road adjacent to the runway. Both pilots assessed the damage and quickly initiated the evacuation procedure. Thankfully, all passengers and crew managed to exit the plane safely, with only a few people sustaining minor injuries. After the investigation, several key points were highlighted regarding airline operational safety and the actions of the pilots. The Australian Transportation Safety Board found that the pilots hadn't fully considered the impact of water on the runway or the incorrect landing configuration of the aircraft. Surprisingly, this wasn't attributed to pilot error, but rather to the airline's standard procedures for these conditions. Another contributing factor was the first officer's inexperience during the approach, as he struggled to maintain the correct speed and glide path. This resulted in a delayed touchdown, preventing the aircraft from using the full length of the runway and ultimately leading to it going off the end. The investigators also pointed to teamwork issues in the cockpit during the final moments of the flight, as the captain did not inform the first officer, who was handling the landing, about his sudden decision to attempt and then cancel a go-around. This left the first officer uncertain and contributed to their failure to notice that the aircraft's automatic braking was not engaged. Up until that point, Qantas had maintained an impressive safety record, standing as one of the oldest continuously operating airlines since its founding in 1920. For decades, Qantas had earned a reputation for excellence in operational safety, with its last major incident occurring in 1960, when a Lockheed L-1049 Super Constellation crashed shortly after takeoff from Mauritius. That incident was the only serious accident in the airline's history until this event, and the arrival of the jet age marked a new era of both opportunities and challenges for the industry and Qantas alike. Not only did this event prompt Qantas to revise and enhance its safety procedures, but it also reinforced the airline's commitment to equipping its crews with specialized training for jet operations. Across the aviation industry, this incident underscored that while jet aircraft offered substantial advancements in efficiency and range, They also demanded fundamental adjustments in operational and safety practices. Fortunately, due to proactive measures taken in response to the incident, this event served as a pivotal learning experience without severe casualties, further strengthening Qantas's resolve to uphold its unparalleled safety record. Despite the challenges to the airline's reputation at the time, this event enabled Qantas to adopt new safety standards that would become part of its lasting legacy. Since then, Qantas has continued to reinforce its image as one of the world's safest airlines, with no fatal accidents to date, solidifying its prestige and reliability well into the jet era. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to leave a like. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of this event impressed you the most? And don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this one.